What if the God of philosophy collapses under its own definition? For centuries, we've been told that God is the most solid concept imaginable, the uncaused cause, the ultimate foundation of truth, morality, and existence itself. But here's the problem. When you actually take that definition seriously, when you examine it using the same logic and mathematics that built modern science, the entire idea begins to crumble. This isn't about opinions. It's not about personal belief or spiritual comfort. It's about whether the definition of God, the classical God of philosophy and theology, can even exist without contradicting itself. And once you see the steps laid out, once you follow the proof from start to finish, the contradiction becomes undeniable. Because the God that is said to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good can't survive the very rules of reason. It's not just unlikely, it's impossible. A logical error so severe, it's like claiming that 2 + 2 = 5. By the end of this journey, you won't just hear an argument. You'll see a formal demonstration, step by step, showing exactly why the God of philosophy collapses, not from outside attack, but from its own definition. The proof begins now. For as long as human beings have wrestled with the deepest questions, where did everything come from? Why is there something instead of nothing? What is the ultimate foundation of reality? Philosophers and theologians have reached for a single towering answer: God. Not just any God, not a local tribal deity or a capricious spirit, but a perfect being, the ultimate mind, the absolute ground of all things. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, René Descartes in the 17th, and Gottfried Leibniz, not long after, all worked to refine this definition. They weren't just defending faith. They were building what they believed was a logical framework, a God that was not vague or mythological, but rigorous, rational, and undeniable. Over time, their definitions crystallized into what we now call the omni triad. 3 properties, 3 absolutes. First, omnipotence. God is all-powerful, able to do anything and everything that is logically possible. No force, no barrier, no rival can limit him. Second, omniscience. God is all-knowing. He sees and comprehends every fact, every possibility, every detail of the past, present, and future. Nothing can be hidden from his perfect awareness. And third, omnibenevolence. God is all good, not just morally flawless, but the very standard of goodness itself. Perfectly loving, incapable of deception or cruelty. These 3 qualities together became the bedrock of classical theism. They are not optional add-ons. They are essential, because if you remove even one, you no longer have the God that Aquinas, Descartes, or Leibniz were describing. Take away omnipotence, and you might have a powerful being, but not the creator of all things. Take away omniscience, and you might have a clever architect, but not an ultimate mind. Take away omnibenevolence, and you might have a mighty ruler, but not a being worthy of worship. Only when all 3 exist simultaneously do you have the God of philosophy and theology, the God billions are told to believe in. But here's where the trouble begins. Because while each property sounds impressive on its own, when you set them side by side and examine how they interact, they form the seeds of disaster, not mythological mystery, not some mystical paradox we must humbly accept, but a full-blown contradiction. And that contradiction is exactly where our proof begins. Let's begin with the attribute that feels the most natural, the one people instinctively imagine first when they think of God, power, omnipotence, the claim that God is all-powerful, able to do anything, no limits, no restrictions. But the moment you try to take this definition seriously, a devastating problem appears. It comes in the form of a deceptively simple question. Can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? At first, it sounds like a child's riddle, the kind of word game you might brush off with a laugh. But look closer, because this is not a joke. This is a formal logical dilemma. There are only two possible answers, yes or no. If the answer is yes, if God can create such a stone, then by definition, he cannot lift it. There is something he cannot do, and therefore, he is not omnipotent. But if the answer is no, if he cannot create such a stone, then again, there is something he cannot do. And once more, he is not omnipotent. Both answers collapse the very concept they were supposed to defend. This is not a clever trick. It is a demonstration of logical incoherence. To say God is omnipotent is like saying someone is a married bachelor, or that they have created a square circle. The words appear meaningful, but they describe nothing that can exist in reality. Now, defenders of the faith have not ignored this problem. For centuries, apologists have tried to wriggle out of the trap. And their most common move is this. They say God can do the logically impossible, that he isn't bound by reason, that our rules of logic are human inventions, and God sits above them. On the surface, this might feel like a solution, but in reality, it explodes the problem into something far worse. Because if God can do the logically impossible, then logic itself no longer applies to him. And if logic no longer applies, then every definition we've ever given of God disintegrates. Think about it. We say God is good, but goodness is a logical concept. If logic doesn't bind him, then the word good becomes meaningless. We say God is the first cause, but causality is part of logic. If logic doesn't apply, then causality doesn't apply, and the claim collapses. We say God is truth itself, but truth is also a logical category, and if he is free from logic, then truth itself loses its meaning. The apologist's escape hatch doesn't rescue God. It detonates the entire framework of classical theism. It leaves us with a being who cannot be described, defined, or defended. A being who could be good, or evil, or both, or neither. A being beyond logic is a being beyond meaning. And that is the fatal blow. The moment you try to define omnipotence seriously, the moment you press it into the cold light of reason, it collapses into nonsense. It is not just difficult to defend, it is impossible to even coherently describe. Omnipotence, as an absolute property, cannot exist. It is self-contradictory, and any God defined by it is already undone. This is only the first step of the proof, but already the foundation is cracked. The mighty God of philosophy has stumbled, and we have only just begun. Now that we've seen how omnipotence collapses under its own weight, let's turn to an even more devastating contradiction. This one doesn't live in abstract riddles or paradoxes. It lives in the real world, in what you and I can see every single day. It's called the problem of evil. And to understand it clearly, let's lay it out in the form of a simple structure. Premise 1. If God is omnipotent, he has the power to prevent all evil, instantly, completely. Premise 2. If God is omniscient, he knows about all evil, every act, every intention, every hidden cruelty before it even happens. Premise 3. If God is omnibenevolent, he would want to prevent all evil. Out of perfect goodness, he would act to stop it. Now, the observation. Evil exists. Suffering exists. Not in tiny corners, not in rare exceptions, but everywhere. And from these 4 points, the conclusion is inescapable. The God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good cannot exist, because the data of the world flatly contradicts the definition. But to see just how devastating this contradiction really is, we need to look closer at the kinds of evil we observe. The first kind is moral evil. This is the suffering caused by human choices: murder, war, genocide, the deliberate harm that one person inflicts on another. The second kind is natural evil, suffering caused not by choice, but by nature itself. Earthquakes that bury children alive, diseases like bone cancer that rot bodies from the inside out, tsunamis that sweep away entire villages. Now, even if we were to grant that moral evil might be explained by free will, that God allows humans to choose, even when those choices cause harm, the problem of natural evil remains untouched, because no human choice creates cancer in a child's bones. No human free will steers the tectonic plates that unleash a tidal wave. And yet, these things happen, over and over again. This leads us to a critical category: gratuitous suffering. Suffering that serves no purpose, no lesson, no higher good. When a child screams in agony from a disease they did nothing to deserve, what good is built? When a storm wipes out thousands of innocent lives in minutes, what higher purpose is achieved? The sheer pointlessness of so much suffering is itself evidence against an all-good designer. And theologians know this, which is why they have offered countless theodicies, explanations designed to defend God against the accusation. The most common is the free will defense, the idea that God allows evil because freedom is a higher good. But as we've seen, this doesn't touch natural evil. It also doesn't explain why the scale of evil is so extreme. Surely free will doesn't require the Holocaust, or centuries of slavery, or generations born into famine. Another is the soul-making defense, the idea that suffering builds character, shapes us, makes us grow. But again, how much is required? Does a baby, gasping for air in its first weeks of life, really need character development? Does an entire population swallowed by a tsunami gain some higher moral strength? Then there's the greater good defense, the claim that every evil is secretly part of a larger plan, that the suffering we see is just one piece of a bigger puzzle. But this is not a solution. It's an appeal to mystery. It asks us to ignore what we see and trust what we cannot. And when you run the numbers, the problem becomes overwhelming. If suffering existed in small doses, if it were rare, if it were evenly distributed, perhaps you could argue it was a teaching tool or a side effect of freedom. But the reality is the opposite. Suffering is massive, uneven, crushingly concentrated in the most vulnerable. Statistically, the distribution of suffering is far greater than what would ever be needed to teach lessons or preserve freedom. It's off the charts. It's not balanced. It's not necessary. It's gratuitous. And gratuitous suffering is incompatible with a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Because if he had the power, he could stop it. If he had the knowledge, he would know it's happening. And if he had the goodness, he would want to stop it. But he doesn't. And the world shows it. Which leaves us with only one conclusion. The omni triad does not match the observable data. The God of philosophy cannot exist in the same universe as the suffering we see. This isn't speculation. It's not cynicism. It's a direct contradiction. The very definition of God fails the test of reality. And that failure isn't just academic. It's not just about abstract debate. It's about the raw human truth that millions live every day. The cries of the child in pain, the destruction of lives by disaster, the silence that follows every desperate prayer for relief. If God were real, as defined, these things would not be, but they are. And so, He is not. The proof is building, and the contradiction is only getting stronger. If the problem of evil shows us contradiction in the world outside, then divine hiddenness shows us contradiction in the world inside, in our hearts, in our experience. Here's the premise. If there truly exists a God who is loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, His existence would be unmistakably clear. Not just clear to theologians, not just clear to philosophers, but clear to everyone, every culture, every person, every sincere seeker. Because think about it, if He is omniscient, He would know exactly what kind of revelation would convince each one of us. The precise words, the precise moment, the precise sign. If He is omnibenevolent, He would want to provide that revelation, because every lost soul matters. Every person deserves a chance to know Him, to avoid error, to escape despair. And if He is omnipotent, He could make that revelation happen, instantly, for all people, without limit. Omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence. Together, they form a perfect guarantee. No one would be left in the dark. And yet, what do we actually observe? We observe silence. We observe sincere seekers who cry out and hear nothing. We observe entire cultures, entire eras of history, where belief in this God never even existed. From a logical standpoint, this is catastrophic, because if the God of classical theism existed, widespread non-belief should be impossible. And yet, it is everywhere. Let's frame this more formally. Premise 1. An omniscient God would know how to reveal Himself to each individual. Premise 2. An omnibenevolent God would want to do so, to save every soul. Premise 3. An omnipotent God could do it without difficulty. Observation: we see massive, persistent, sincere non-belief. Conclusion: the God defined by these properties does not exist. This is not a minor puzzle. It is a direct contradiction between the definition and the evidence. Philosophers often use a Bayesian lens to describe this problem. They ask, given the hypothesis of a loving God, how likely is the world we see? And the answer is simple. It's very unlikely. So unlikely that the observation of divine silence massively reduces the probability that such a God exists at all. Because what we would expect to see is universal clarity. But what we actually see is doubt, division, and endless searching. Now, let's step away from logic for a moment. Let's put this in human terms. Imagine a parent with infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite love for their child. Now imagine that child, lost in the dark, crying out for comfort, desperate for a sign that the parent is near. And imagine that parent staying silent, deliberately hidden, ignoring the cries. What would we call that? We would call it neglect, cruelty, a betrayal of love. No one would excuse it in a human parent. So why excuse it in a divine one? This is the emotional core of divine hiddenness. It's not about prideful doubt. It's about the sincere, honest seeking that is met with nothing. And when you add that silence to the paradox of omnipotence and the contradiction of evil, the chain grows unbreakable. God as defined, should be undeniable. Instead, he is absent. And that absence is not mystery. It is evidence. Evidence that the being described as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good does not exist. Because silence itself is a contradiction. We've now followed 3 separate paths, 3 lines of reasoning that begin in different places, but converge on the same conclusion. The first was the paradox of omnipotence, a logical contradiction at the very heart of the definition. The idea of an all-powerful being collapses into nonsense the moment you press it. The second was the problem of evil, an empirical contradiction, a world filled with suffering that cannot be reconciled with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. And the third was divine hiddenness, an experiential contradiction, the silence of God in the lives of sincere seekers, silence that makes no sense if he truly desires relationship with his creation. Each one of these arguments, on its own, is devastating, but together, they form an irrefutable chain. Logic says no. Evidence says no. Experience says no. And the weight of all 3 at once crushes the definition entirely. If you wanted to put it in the simplest mathematical form, it would look like this: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. The 3 together. Call it O to the 3rd power. O cubed God. Now set that equation against reality, against what we can actually observe, measure, and live through. And what do we find? O cubed God not equal reality. The equation doesn't balance. The math doesn't compute. The definition fails its own test. This is not a minor inconsistency. It is a fatal contradiction. The God of philosophy doesn't just lack evidence. He fails the most basic requirement of existence: coherence. The proof is unified. The contradiction is complete. By now, the contradictions should be clear. But if you've ever debated these ideas before, you know what usually comes next. The objections, the escape hatches, the ways people try to keep the idea of God alive, even as the definition collapses. The first, and perhaps the most common, is this: God works in mysterious ways. On the surface, it sounds humble, it sounds reverent, but look at what it actually does. It takes a direct contradiction, suffering that should not exist, silence that should not be possible, and it sweeps it into a fog of mystery. It doesn't solve the problem, it avoids it. Because if mystery is the answer, then no definition is safe. You can no longer claim God is good, because goodness is a human concept we can understand. You can no longer claim He is just, or loving, or merciful. All of those words rely on meanings, and if everything is mystery, the meanings dissolve. The second move is this: our logic is too limited. Maybe the contradiction is only apparent. Maybe God's ways are higher. Maybe the rules of reason don't bind Him. But again, notice what happens when you take this seriously. If logic doesn't apply, then nothing we say about God can hold. Not omnipotence, not omniscience, not omnibenevolence, because all of those terms are defined by logic. You don't get to use reason to build the house, to argue that God must exist because of causality or morality or design, and then throw reason away when the foundation cracks. That isn't a defense. It's an admission of defeat. The third move is faith fills the gaps. When reason fails, just believe. But faith doesn't fix contradictions. Faith doesn't make 2 + 2 = 5. It doesn't turn a square into a circle. It doesn't make an incoherent definition suddenly coherent. Faith in this context is not a bridge, it's a blindfold. And here is the ultimate trap. Every one of these escape hatches, mystery, limited logic, blind faith, abandons the very tools that gave God his definition in the first place. If you say logic doesn't apply, you cannot meaningfully claim God is good. If you say reason doesn't bind him, you cannot call him powerful, or knowing, or loving, because those words are only meaningful within the framework of logic. So the moment you reject logic, you reject the definition itself. And that means you are no longer talking about the God of philosophy at all. If logic doesn't apply, you cannot meaningfully define God at all. So what do we do with all of this? The contradictions, the paradoxes, the silence. At first glance, it might feel heavy, even bleak, like pulling the rug out from under the deepest foundation humanity has ever claimed. But here's the truth. This is not bad news. It's good news. Because if the God of philosophy is a contradiction, then we are not living inside some cruel experiment. We are not pawns in a divine puzzle we can never solve. We are not guilty simply for being human. Instead, we are free. Free to build morality not from fear of punishment or hope of reward, but from empathy, compassion, and reason. Free to face suffering not as a mystery we must endure, but as a challenge we can confront. Together, through science, through medicine, through solidarity, free to create meaning in our own lives. Not waiting for a voice from heaven that never comes, but crafting purpose from the love we give, the truth we seek, and the progress we build. This shift isn't a loss, it's a liberation. Because when you strip away the contradictions, you find something far more empowering underneath. A vision of humanity that is responsible for itself. A vision that doesn't hide behind mystery, but rises with clarity. Reason and compassion are better guides than divine silence. They are brighter lights than mystery ever was. And if we have the courage to follow them, there's no limit to the kind of world we can build. God isn't mysterious. God is contradictory. Omnipotence collapses into paradox. The problem of evil collapses under the weight of reality. And divine hiddenness collapses in the silence of experience. 3 strikes, 1 conclusion. The proof is complete. And if this journey has shifted your perspective, even a little, then I want to hear from you. Share your own experiences in the comments. Moments of unanswered prayer. Times when silence spoke louder than words. And if you believe more people need to see this chain of evidence laid out, share this video. Spread it. Because conversations like this matter. And don't forget to subscribe. This was only the beginning. In the next video, we'll uncover another hidden contradiction buried deep within religion. One most people have never noticed. Until then, follow reason, seek truth, and never be afraid to ask the questions that matter most.